Hashem, today's Daf Yomi will start on the bottom of Nun Tes Base 59b, around 8 lines from the bottom. Well, let's summarize what we're discussing. The Gemara has said back on 59a that Rav was of the position that if the Mizbeach was damaged, then any carbon that was slaughtered at that time is disqualified also. And the Gemara said, doesn't this contradict another statement of Rav about that if the Mizbeach HaKetoras, that if the incense altar, as opposed to the altar we were discussing, which was the altar of Mizbeach HaOlah, which was the altar for a sacrifice, but if the incense altar was removed, you could just put another one in its place. And so the Gemara says, no, like Rabbi Yehuda said elsewhere, that he is modeh b'damim, that he admits that he doesn't say his law in a case of blood, so too Rabbi Rav does not say his law as it relates to the Mizbeach. He says his law about the inner altar. That's where he says it can be, you could just put it in its place, but if it's missing. But he doesn't say it about the blood altar. In that context, the Gemara wants to know, where do we have this teaching that modeh Rabbi Yehuda b'damim, that Rabbi Yehuda admits that he doesn't apply his law by case of blood. And so the Gemara says that there was a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi with respect to the Mizbeach that Shlomo Melech dedicated in the Beis HaMikdash on the day that he built the temple, and he dedicated the temple. So Rabbi Yehuda says the Mizbeach was too small to contain all the 142,000 offerings that Shlomo Melech brought that day. And so Shlomo Melech had to sanctify the floor of the altar, to bring karbanos on the floor. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, the Mizbeach was for sure big enough, because Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach had 1,000 offerings, and it was very small. And so this Mizbeach of Shlomo, which was proportionally bigger, could have held up to 400,000 offerings. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was not as small as Rabbi Yossi said, and he reads the verse to say that actually the Mizbeach was actually bigger, because he compares it to a verse in Yechezkel, whereas Rabbi Yossi doesn't compare it to the verse in Yechezkel. Rabbi Yossi says that the word Ravua, which Rabbi Yehuda used to compare it to the verse in Yechezkel, he uses it to say that the Mizbeach of Moshe is compared to the Mizbeach HaKetoras, the inner altar, and that it's twice, its height is twice the size of the length and the width. So now the Gemara says that when Rabbi Yehuda heard that Rabbi Yossi says that the Mizbeach was twice the size of the width, meaning it was 10 amos high. So now 8 lines from the bottom, Amalei Rabbi Yehuda says, how could you say that the Mizbeach is so high? Efshar Kohen Omen al Gavi Mizbeach. The upshot of that is that according to you, the Kohen is standing on the altar, and he's doing his service. And everybody is watching him do the service, and that's not appropriate, because it's supposed to be done in a modest, discreet manner. So you say the altar in the courtyard was so high, but it was a problem because if it's too high, people could see it. So Amal Rabbi Yossi, so Rabbi Yossi reads a few psukim to tell us that there was a curtain around it. Because it says, one pasuk says, he compares the curtains of the courtyard and the curtains of Mishkan that are around the altar. What does that mean? Ma Mishkan Yud Amos, just like the Mishkan, the curtains around the Mishkan itself, just like the Mishkan, which had curtains around it, was 10 Amos. Av Mizbeach, so too the altar needed curtains around it that were at least 10 amos, at least 10 amos high. The Omer, it states, Tulayim Chamesh Esrei Amos. There's another Ela Katef. And then it says that the curtains were 15 amos towards the entrance. And so the assumption here is that the whole courtyard had curtains that were 15 amos high. So Matam Omer Hey Amos. Why does another verse say that the curtains were 5 amos high? Misfas Mizbeach from the lid of the altar and up, there was another 5 amos. So that's what Rabbi Yossi says, that basically there were curtains around the altar, and so therefore you couldn't be able to see in. So if that's the case, so why is there another pasuk that says The altar was 3 amos high. No, says Rabbi Yossi, that's misfas sovev omal. That's only from the sovev upward. Only from the ledge upward was it 3 amos high. But really, the altar was 10 amos with another curtain around it of 5 amos. So the Gemara says, the Rabbi Yehuda, and what does Rabbi Yehuda do with this word Rav, which Rabbi Yossi compares it to the inner altar, the golden altar. Rabbi Yehuda, ki gamer gzer shava berachava hu de gamer. He was telling us that it's the same size, that the mizbech is the same width and length as the altar that was listed in Ezekiel, not that it's the same width and length, but that it was in quadrants the size, and not the size that's actually listed, but that it was in quadrants. So the Gemara says, well, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, how come it's Chazi Kohen? Because even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that we take this verse, we're in Samach Hamad Aleph on the 4th line, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that we take this verse literally, still, we have a problem because you could still see the Kohen because the altar itself was 3 amos high, but the curtains were only 5 amos, and the Kohen himself, the regular person, is 3 amos. So therefore, you could see the Kohen when he's doing the service, and so Rabbi Yehuda himself should be bothered by that question. So the Gemara says no. Rabbi Yehuda would respond, the Kohen mischazi, avoda to biyado mischazi. Yeah, you could see the Kohen, but you wouldn't actually see the rituals because the rituals were in his hand, so that you wouldn't see. So now the Gemara says, okay, it makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda said that the altar of Moshe was smaller than Rabbi Yossi, and so therefore it wouldn't have been able to hold all of the sacrifices that Shlomo brought that day. That's why it says there that Shlomo Melech had to sanctify the floor because he had to use the floor as a mizbeach that day. Rabbi Yossi, my kiddush, but according to Rabbi Yossi, that the mizbeach was big enough. So what does it mean that Shlomo sanctified? What did he sanctify? Why did he sanctify the floor? And the Gemara says, no, it just means he sanctified it in order to establish an altar there in the courtyard, but it didn't mean that the floor was literally sanctified. And then the Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Yossi makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi, Hainu Dirsiv Katon. It makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that Shlomo Melech's Mizbeach was very big, and Moshe's Mizbeach was small. That's why it says that the altar was small. This refers to the copper altar that's why it says that he put up a big altar because Moshe's altar was too small. That makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda. Hainu Dirsiv Katon. That's why it says in the verse that on that day he set up an altar because the Mizbech and Nachoshes Asher Afnei Hashem Katon Me'achil. The other altar was too small, so he had to put up a bigger one. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, the new altar wasn't big enough. So Rabbi Yehuda, my Katon. Why is he saying it was small? Because he says the new altar was also too small. So why does it say that the Mizbeach HaNachoshes was too small, the altar of Moshe was too small, when the new altar was also too small? So, because if you look at the verse says, Ki Hashem As'olavas Amechavas Chavei Hashem Ki Mizbeach HaNachoshes Asher Afnei Hashem Katon Me'achil As'olah. Because the copper altar that was before Hashem was too small to contain the Olah. But so according to Rabbi Yossi, it makes sense that Moshe's altar was too small, so Solomon had to build a new one. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that they had to sacrifice on the floor, they put the sacrifice on the floor. Well, the new altar was also too small. So what does that verse mean? So the Gemara says, what does it mean? It means as this. It means, my katon hachikamer mizbech avanim she'asa Shlomo tachas mizbech hanachoshes katon hava or katon. He says no. It means that the altar. It means as follows: that the altar of stones that Shlomo made instead of the altar of copper that Moshe made, that also was too small. The new altar was too small itself, and so therefore, and because it was staying in the place of the copper altar, it called it a mizbeach hanachoshes. Meaning to say, he reads it like this. Rashi says. So he says, mizbeach avanim she'asa Shlomo tachas mizbeach hanachoshes. He did it in the place of the mizbeach hanachoshes. And it was too small, but really it was a Mizbeach HaNachoshes, but it was too small because it was in the place of the Mizbeach HaNachoshes. And actually, Rashi points out that in Divrei Hayamim, it's also literally called of Mizbeach HaNechoshes. So that the new altar was also too small. So, but my pligi, what's the fundamental dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda? So Rabbi Yehuda compares the word Ravua that says about the altar it's described in the Torah, the altar of Moshe, and he compares it to the word Ravua in Ezekiel to say that the altar was bigger in size than the one that's listed in Torah, whereas Rabbi Yossi compares it to the golden altar to say that it was taller than it was listed. So the Gemara says, what's their dispute? So Rabbi Yehuda says we compare the outer altar in the Torah to the outer altar in Ezekiel because they're both in the courtyard, and we don't compare it to the inner altar because the inner altar is inside the sanctuary, whereas this one's outside. Done in kli mikli, main done in kli binyan. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says we compare kli to the kli. We compare the two altars. One is inside, one is outside, and we don't compare it to the binyan, i.e., to the building of the permanent temple, or the future temple that Ezekiel was prophesizing about. Amarava. So now, in that context, we have this dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says they had to they put all the sacrifices on the floor and they burnt them on the floor. Rava says about that, Moda Rabbi Yehuda v'damim. Rabbi Yehuda admits that they still use the mizbeach for the blood. They put the animals and they burnt them on the floor, but Rabbi Yehuda admitted they still needed the sacrifice, the altar for the blood. And that's what Rav says also about when he said that the golden altar was moved, the Keturah altar was moved, but he wouldn't say that about the outer altar because there he admits by the blood you need the actual altar. You can't just put it in its place. And the Gemara now says, Rava says, or the Gemara cites a brisa to prove this position of Rabbi Yehuda about the blood. You had a question? So the Gemara says, how do we know? And we already had this source earlier back on, we had it back on, we had it back on Lamadal on the base because what happened? Rabbi Yehuda says that there was so much blood of the Korban Pesach, and there was a concern that maybe some of that blood wasn't sprinkled onto the mizbeach. So they would take a full cup from the blood that was all mixed together on the floor, and they would pour it on the altar. Why? Because if, let's say, the blood of one of these animals had spilled, nimtza zemach shiro, so then by pouring it on the altar, you make sure that at least it went straight on the altar and it was kosher. So that's what they used to do. So now the Gemara's proof, Rava's proof that Rabbi Yehuda was moda by damim. Rabbi Yehuda kula azar mekach. If Rabbi Yehuda says that the entire floor of the courtyard was holy, why would you need to pour it on? You've already done the mitzvah. It's on the floor of the altar. Gemara says, what kind of proof is that? Maybe you need to pour it on from a human being, and just falling onto the ground from your utensil is not going to be sufficient. So the Gemara says, still, why didn't you pour it on the altar? Why don't you just pick it up and pour it in its place? So isn't that sufficient to prove that you need to pour it on the altar, like Rabbi was saying? Gemara said, no, what kind of proof is that? Maybe Dilma Mishum Debeina Mitzvah Min HaMuvchar. No, you want to do the mitzvah the right way, which is to pour it on the altar. And this, it'd be okay on the floor, but it doesn't mean that it wouldn't, that's ideal. So they want to do it the ideal way. So that price is not a proof for Rava's position. So this whole thing we said to say Rabbi Yehuda is moda by damim, Gemara doesn't have a proof that he is. Rabbi Elazar says, we had said yesterday's daf that if the altar was slaughtered, that if the altar was broken, an animal that was slaughtered while the altar was broken is disqualified. Well, let's say the animal was slaughtered and the altar was okay, but then after the animal was slaughtered and the blood was sprinkled, then the altar became damaged. Mizbeach shenifkam, the altar became damaged, ein ochlin begino. And now you have the remnants of the mincha, the grain offering, which you're supposed to eat. But since the altar is damaged, you don't eat from it. You can't eat from it. You can't eat from the offering while the altar is damaged. How do we know that? Because it states, matzos eitzo hamizbeach, and they shall eat the matzos this is by the miluim, you shall eat the matzos next to the altar. But the chiyetzal mizbeach, did they actually eat it next to the mizbeach? They weren't required to. They could have eaten it in the entire courtyard. So they didn't have to eat it next to the altar. So it means that you can only eat the korban when the mizbeach is complete and not when it's damaged. Gemara says, okay, Ashkan Shiar Mincha, we find this law by the remnants of the korban mincha. Kachi Kalamino, and how do we know that it's also okay by not just by korban mincha, but also kache kachim, by also the most sacred offerings, that you can only eat it if the mizbeach is complete. Tamar Kodesh Kodashim. It says in the verse about the mincha that it is Kodesh Kodashim. So kache kalam. Well, what about the kache kalam, like the shlomim? How do we know that also you can only eat it if the mizbeach is complete? From Rabbiya, Asya Midrasha de Rabbi Yossi. We learn that from Midrasha that Rabbi Yossi made. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer Gimel Dvarim, and we already had this back in Makros. Rabbi Yossi said three things. Mishum Gimel Zekanim on the top of Samach Base. He said three things in the name of three elders. This is one of the three things he said in the name of the three elders. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, one of them is Rabbi Shmuel said Yachol Yaleh Adam Meiser Sheni Yerushalayim. That I might think you have to take up your Meiser Sheni, or that your that a person should take up his Meiser Sheni. That's a secondary tithe that he's supposed to eat in Jerusalem. I might think that even though the base of Mikdash is destroyed, you should still take up the Meiser Sheni, your grains, to eat it in Jerusalem nowadays. And I might think you could prove it from a logical argument. What's the logical argument? Vidinu, Bechor Ta'on Avos Makom. The firstborn animal requires the base of Mikdash in order to be brought. Umaiser Ta'on Avos Makom. And also Meiser Sheni requires to be in Jerusalem. Ma Bechor Eino El B'fnei Abayis. It's just like the firstborn animal is only brought as an offering if there's a temple. Av Meiser Eino El B'fnei Abayis. Also the Meiser Sheni, I might think, it should only be brought up to Jerusalem if there is the temple. But we'd say, or the opposite. But a firstborn animal, it requires not just the base of Mikdash, it requires an application of the blood to the altar and the inner parts to be burnt on the altar. So therefore, you don't have to bring it up. So Bikurim so Meiser Sheni doesn't require that. So maybe you should bring it up even without the base of Mikdash. So then let's bring a proof from Bikurim, which you don't bring up without the base of Mikdash. But Gemara says, but don't bring a proof to me from Bikurim. Mal Bikurim shekein tunin hanacha. The Bikurim require to be placed next to the altar. So therefore, I might think you have to bring up the Meiser Sheni. Vevesa, Tamomer Vevesa Shama O Seichem. The pasuk says you should bring up your Oah v'zivchechem. That's Maser Seichem. That's Trumas Yadchem and Idrechem and Itfosechem. Meaning to say, the pasuk says, the verse compares Makish Meiser Bechor. The verse compares the Meiser Sheni to the firstborn animal. Ma Bechor Eino El B'fnei Abayis. Av Meiser Eino El B'fnei Abayis. So there's a verse to tell us that Meiser Sheni is only when the temple is standing. Gemara first interrupts this limud. The Gemara interrupts this to tell us that Gemara says, wait 1 second, why do you have to cite a verse? The Gemara often, when you try to bring a proof from two things and neither one works by itself, they'll try and bring them together. Why don't we just try to compare from the common denominator of Bikurim and Bechor? The Gemara says, no, Mishum De'iko Mifra, because that could be busted by saying, both of those two laws, Bechor and Bikurim, require the altar, and Meiser Sheni doesn't require the altar. But what does the author of this what did the author of this statement say? What's Rabbi Yossi saying? Rabbi Yossi is saying, "My kasavar." What's his position? Kasavar kedusha, because he assumed that Bechor requires the base of Mikdash, and he needed to prove that Meiser Sheni also requires the base of Mikdash. But he proved that the Bechor requires the base of Mikdash. But what's his position? Kasavar kedusha rishona kitchel ashatav kitchel. Piece of the assumption that when the base of Mikdash was sanctified, its sanctity is still around. It was sanctified forever. If that's the case, afilu bechor nami, then he should also have to bring a firstborn, as long as there's a mizbeach. Even the firstborn he should bring, because that will be the position that you bring the offering, even though there's no temple, like we said like we said in Megillah on Daf Yud, because it has the sanctity of the temple, even without the temple. And if he says, well, the sanctity is not there anymore, then afilu bechor nami tibai. So he should, so he should anyways ask about the firstborn, just like he's asking about the Meiser. If he's not sure if it was sanctified, he should say, can you still do stuff to bring the firstborn? So Amar Avinu Olam Kasavar Lo Kitcha. He says it wasn't sanctified. What we're talking about here is a case where Bechor Shenizra, so it wasn't sanctified for the future. So if that's the case, why does he have a question? Why doesn't he ask about the Bechor? Because he says we're talking about a case, but Bechor Shenizrak Damo Kodem Chorban Abayis. Talking about a case of firstborn animal where the carbon was brought before the temple was destroyed, and then the Romans came in and destroyed it, and now he has the meat. He had sprinkled the blood. Mecharva Abayis Radayim B'Saro Kayim, and the meat is still around. Iskish B'Saro Damo, and we compare the blood to the meat. Ma Damo Mizbeach Af B'Saro. Just like for the blood, you require the altar. Also, the meat, you require the altar. So now, this is a long way of saying that for kachim kalam, you also require the altar. We answer that question because bechor is a type of shlamim. So for kachim kalam, you also require the shlamim. Va'asi meiser. So now the Gemara, and then at the end of this statement, he says va'asa meiser v'yolav mibechor. And meiser sheni, we learn out from bechor that something that requires the temple, that it requires the Mizbeach or the temple, and so therefore you can't eat the Meiser Sheni nowadays. Gemara says, wait 1 second, we have a different problem, which we had learned, remember, just back on Mem Hey, V'chidavar Alame Behekesh, Choser Malame Behekesh. Well, if the Bechor is learned out from a Hekesh, Chidavar Malame Mehekesh, if something is itself learned out from a Hekesh, so the Bechor is learned out from a Hekesh of the Basar to the Dam, and now it's going to teach us about the Meiser. You can't do that. Gemara says, no, Meiser is not Kachim. So this law that once you learn out from a comparison, you can't teach it to a comparison. Not only applies to Kachim and Meiser Dagan Chulani. The Meiser Sheni is not considered Kachim, it's considered Chulin. And so therefore, because you could eat it, you just have to eat it in Jerusalem. And so therefore, you can do it. The Gemara says, but that was a dispute. And this only works according to one who says that, like we said back earlier, Mem Hey, Basar Lamed Azlin, and we follow the one that is derived, i.e. the Chulin. According to the one who says we follow the one who's doing the teaching, Ma'iko Amemar, what would you say in this case? Because it's Basar Lamed Azlin, and the Kachim is doing the teaching. So the Gemara says, no, Damu Basar Chada Milsi. The first source, the Bechor, the Basar is not a Hekesh from Dam. They're one thing. That they're considered basically one law together. Even though the Torah separated them, since the meat is prohibited before you throw the blood, so it's like it's one thing. So hold on, we'll stop the recording here, but we could go on a little bit because today's daf. We'll stop and we'll go on.